Two theses fill the mind with awe and wonder. The first is Aristotle's oracular proclamation that being can be said in many ways. Metaphysics is the science of first principles that studies being qua being, in a way that avoids the dogmatism of some ancient schools and the skepticism of more modern approaches. Kant was hailed by some critics as being the great destroyer. Critical philosophy with its hylomorphic concerns certainly demolished reductionist materialism and certain forms of spiritual dualism, such as Cartesianism, but we have argued in earlier works that it is best seen as a continuation of the metaphysical project that Aristotle began over 2,000 years ago. The second thesis of awe and wonder, therefore, relates to the Kantian account of knowledge, which is summarized in the following. Hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. But all attempts to extend knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori, by means of concepts have, on this assumption, ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics, if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge, as regards objects which are thought solely through reason, and indeed as necessary, but which can never, at least not in the manner that reason thinks them, be given in experience. The attempts at thinking them will furnish an excellent touchstone of what we are adopting as our new method of thought, namely, that we can know a priori of things only what we ourselves have put into them. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Trans Kemp Smith, N. London, Macmillan, 1963, page 22-23. Metaphysical accounts of being must, then, begin with principles known a priori in contexts of explanation/justification, which objects conform to. These principles form the a priori base for natural investigations. Science, on this view, is not cast in the role of a student of nature, posing explorative questions, but rather as a judge possessing knowledge of the law, deciding which laws to apply, and how to apply them in contexts of explanation/justification. The role of experience here is via our intuitions which relate to the phenomena we experience as appearances, whether that be in the form of visual/auditory/olfactory or taste sensation or somatosensory sensation. Such forms of experience cannot of course reveal the object's existence as it is in itself. The imagination is constituted of representations of sensory experiences, but imaginative experiences can be an antecedent to the conceptualization of a number of intuitions, or alternatively, relate to the practical goals and ends of the faculty of sensibility, which can, in turn, be related to appetitive or higher forms of desire, such as compassion, antagonism, courage, ambition. Issues related to the advancement or inhibition of the life instinct, eros. The practical goal of Aristotelian eudaimonia is not to be translated as a happy life, but rather as a good-spirited, flourishing life, which can only be achieved if one is worthy of whatever feeling of happiness one is experiencing. The question to raise here, then, is whether there are a priori intuitions other than time and space, related to our practical life. Are there, for example, intuitions related to our instincts which refer, of course, to our motor rather than our sensory activity? According to Campbell, our fantasy life arises from our body, which he insists is composed of a system of organs. Aristotle included our limb configuration and tissues in his idea of the body, whose first actuality is the soul. This hylomorphic account is the basis of Spinoza's idea that the first idea of the mind or the soul is the idea of the body. O'Shaughnessy speaks in his work, The Will, a dual aspect theory, of a body image which does not include the internal organs, but is related to those parts of the body that are under the control of the will, e.g. the limbs and their extensions, hands, feet, etc. It is clear, however, with instinctive behaviors relating to hunger, that the organs play as large a role as the will. Aggression does, however, seem to be more intimately and immediately connected to the motor system. The sensory-motor associations of these primary and primitive responses also form a part of experiences relating to feeding and fighting, and these associations do not appear to be a natural part of our system of ideas, but may certainly link up to language and its various sensory and motor functions. Wittgenstein, in his investigations of the phenomena of pain and how it is related to our language functions, claims that I learned to replace my exclamations of pain by saying the words, "I am in pain," which replace and perhaps sublimate my instinctive response. The words, "he is in pain," on the other hand, are used in relation to the behavior and circumstances which give rise to pain responses. This first process of learning language may be a part of sublimating the pain response under the language function of telling people about my pain and seeking their compassion for my predicament. The first function of the Freudian ego is to protect the body, and the role of pain is obvious in such a process. Compassion in relation to my pain also becomes an important feature of our human form of life striving to survive and lead a life that is both good-spirited and flourishing, eudaimonia. These reflections are unquestionably hylomorphic and require elaboration of the kind we find in William James's Principles of Psychology. Instinct is usually defined as the faculty of acting in such a way as to produce certain ends without foresight of the ends and without previous education in the performance. Volume 2, page 383. William James, we know, also regarded consciousness not as an entity, but as a function, and to that extent might have agreed with Freud that consciousness was in fact a vicissitude of instinct. For James, function is caused by structure, which includes organic structure, and he rejects the application of own ideas, such as self-preservation, to the instinctive activities of animals, activities which appear to have the consequence of survival. Apart from the consequences, however, it seems relatively straightforward that the animal is striving to live, to stay alive, even if we cannot attribute an own human idea of staying alive to them. Animals do not live in the world of ideas, they are not language users, and have no use for the language function of representing things in their absence, as is the case with the human sush, form of life. The animal and human form of life, however, according to James, may well include the function of a sensible form of imagination. James quotes Schneider's Der Thierisch Will. Schneider subdivides impulses into sensation impulses, perception impulses, and idea impulses. To crouch from cold is a sensation impulse. To turn and follow if we see people running one way is a perception impulse. To cast about for cover if it begins to blow and rain is an imaginative impulse. A single complex instinctive action may involve successively the awakening of impulses of all three classes. Thus a hungry lion starts to seek prey by the awakening in him of imagination coupled with desire. Principles of Psychology, page 385. Hunger and reproduction are goals of animal forms of life, but even if they possess sensory-motor systems similar to ours, there are significant differences between the two forms of life. Aristotle defined the human sush in hylomorphic terms of rational animal capable of discourse, a form of life that includes walking upright on two legs, a posture in which the sense of smell becomes less important than the sense of sight, which, in its turn, becomes a key power in the human repertoire of powers that, of course, includes a complex language that gives rise to relating to objects in their absence and various forms of rationally based abstract thought. Different dominating powers of perception, smell versus vision, give rise, in its turn, to different forms of motor activity, which partly define our relation to our environment and the future dimension of time. The mechanisms that help to define the animal power of memory, which is more tightly tied to the environment than is our human power, are associative, and William James has given an excellent account of this mechanism, in terms of the role of the brain and the chemical/electrical activity activating this primary organ of the body. The animal has different powers, partly because it has a different configuration of limbs and organs as compared with the configuration that allows the human to walk upright and engage with the environment in a more indirect fashion. The animal certainly has a different, less complex brain without the networks of connections and differentiations we find in the human brain. Our human networks permit the inhibition of primary reflexes and the possible resultant delay in wished-for gratifications. This may be a consequence of the possibility for the human brain to form a more complex representation of the end of activities it engages in, using this representation to initiate a sequence of behaviors to bring about this end. Many psychologists have appealed to the role of consciousness in the learning of new skills, and whilst Freud regarded consciousness as a vicissitude of the instincts, Freud and William James were both at pains to diminish its importance for the human sush, claiming that it is but one psychological function amongst many others. For William James, in his essay, Does Consciousness Exist?, his starting point was pure experience. Thoughts, James argued, perform the function of knowing in relation to pure experience, and he further suggested that consciousness is a principle of such knowing. James posits two polarities of experience, the one being the subject or bearer of the above knowledge, and the other being the object known. The hemispheres of the brain, James argues, provide humans and animals with a consciousness of memory, which of course is composed of the representations of absent objects that may or may not connect directly to the motor system and some form of activity. If the activity is concerned with the protection of the body from, for example, a rattlesnake confronting one on a narrow cliff path, the experience will be composed of both perception, groups of sensations, expectation, emotions, feelings of terror, and presumably action taken to avoid the calamity of a possible bite. Many of the images composing this experience will be composed of images from the past experiences of my memory system. These will be lodged in both the hemispheres of the brain. Primitive instincts relating to the protection of the body will be mobilized by the perception of the snake. Sexual behavior, too, involves the cortex of the hemispheres, given all the societal prohibitions governing the appropriateness considerations for such kinds of action. This, however, is a remark that highlights the material cause or aspect of sexuality which, of course, has its root in several regions of the body, including the sexual organs and the organs of sight and touch. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his work, The Phenomenology of Perception, embraces Freudian theory which has both Platonic and Aristotelian elements. For Freud himself, the sexual is not the genital. Sexual life is not the mere effect of the processes having their seat in the genital organs. The libido is not an instinct, that is, an activity naturally directed towards definite ends. It is the general power, which the psychosomatic subject enjoys, of taking root in different settings, of establishing himself through different experiences, of gaining structures of conduct. It is what causes man to have a history. In so far as a man's sexual history provides a key to his life, it is because, in his sexuality, is projected in his manner of being towards the world, that is, towards time and other men. Page 181. Even within the complex networks of both hemispheres, we can find reference to what James regards as intelligence, a global power of the human sush, in relation to the pursuit of the ends of not just life, but the good-spirited flourishing life. In all ages, the man whose determinations are swayed by reference to the most distant ends has been held to possess the highest intelligence. The tramp who lives from hour to hour, the bohemian whose engagements are from day to day, the bachelor who builds but for a single life, the father who acts for another generation, the patriot who thinks of a whole community and many generations, and finally the philosopher and saint whose cares are for humanity and for eternity. James W. Principles, Volume 1, page 23. This ancient concept of intelligence is holistic, emphasizing as it does the ability or capacity to lead a particular form of life, connected to the principle of how good such a form of life is. Our modern theoretical concept of intelligence connected to intelligence testing abstracts from the practical idea James is using, which, of course, has a more intimate relation to practical than theoretical rationality. Aristotle claimed in the opening to his work, The Nicomachean Ethics, that all human activity aims at the good, and this is why the Platonic form of good is so important in the characterization of our human forms of life. The Greeks thought in terms of three broad categories of the good, namely the goods for the body, the goods for the soul, and the goods of the external world. In relation to these categories, the tramp, bohemian, and bachelor lead more limited lives as compared to the father, patriot, philosopher, and saint, whose lives are certainly more complex and the result of more complex histories. In man, language plays an essential role in both his capacity for discourse and his rationality, which are also measures of the intelligence with which he engages with in his life. Take, for example, the faculty of language. It involves in reality a host of distinct powers. We must first have images of concrete things and ideas of abstract qualities and relations. We must next have the memory of words, and then the capacity so to associate each idea or image with a particular word that, When the word is heard, the idea shall forthwith enter our mind. We must, conversely, as soon as the idea arises in our mind, associate with it a mental image of the word, and by means of this image we must innovate our articulatory apparatus so as to reproduce the word as physical sound. To read or write a language, other elements still must be introduced. James, pages 28 to 9. Writing and reading have cultural consequences which greatly enhance their value as forms of human activity, and therefore are regarded as both civilization-building and culture-creating activities. Even this form/use of language must, in the end, be related to the sensory-motor constituents of the brain which James, together with Huglings-Jackson, pages 29 to 30, maintains is the material of the mind. The form or organization of this material in the cortex is related to the consciousness he claims is seated in the hemispheres of the brain. James, we recall, thinks of this term as designating both a function and a principle, related to the perceptions and considerations that are the task of hemispheres, in which memories of our past experiences reside. Freud, too, was influenced by Huglings-Jackson, in particular his thesis that higher functions of the brain can assimilate lower functions, such as hunger, and turn dining into a complex social occasion, encompassing many of the higher pleasures relating to life. Another task of the hemispheres must be to delay gratification of all kinds, including the sexual. They can also delay responses in favor of other more rational responses, built upon knowledge of how the external world operates and knowledge of the norms and values of the society. The ego, Freud argued, is the agency of the mind that mediates between the lower impulse-driven psychological functions and the higher, more abstract normative considerations of what we ought and ought not to do. The ego also has the function of performing the task of monitoring the external world in the light of its knowledge. It responds to pain by forming memories of what ought or ought not to be done, and it strives for the pleasures of life in accordance with the Aristotelian principle of the golden mean and the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. Pleasure/pain has a particular bodily history for Freud, a history in which pleasure is first located around the mouth and moves through various zones to the genital area, before becoming a global bodily phenomenon in a process of psychosexual development. This process has clearly hylomorphic commitments. Pain, however, for Freud was the great educator, and the ego was therefore designated as a precipitate of lost valued objects. In mourning our losses, we respond to such objects or the memories of them in accordance with what Freud called the reality principle. The whole business of a human life is a complex one, and many vicissitudes of the instincts are formed and used on the road to attempting to lead the good-spirited, flourishing life. We do not find sympathy for the Freudian rationalist position in James' radical empiricism, but there is a focus on relatively holistic ideas, such as consciousness, intelligence, and forms of life, which all relate significantly to the Freudian reality principle, that, in turn, is related to both Platonic, Aristotelian, and Kantian explanatory strategies. James does not believe in the transcendental ego of Kantian philosophy, preferring a thesis of pluralistic psychology that assumes many different selves, not tied together by a transcendental I or ego that connects and differentiates representations. Kant argues, however, that without this transcendental owner of experience, knowledge as a phenomenon would not be possible at all. Consciousness of self, according to the determinations of our state in inner perception, is merely empirical, and always changing. No fixed and abiding self can present itself in this flux of inner appearances. Such consciousness is usually named inner sense or empirical apperception. What has necessarily to be represented as numerically identical cannot be thought as such through empirical data. To render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experiences and which makes experience itself possible. There can be, in us, no modes of knowledge, no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another, without that unity of consciousness which precedes all data of intuitions, and by relation to which representation of objects is alone possible. This pure, original, unchangeable consciousness I shall name transcendental apperception. That it deserves this name is clear from the fact that even the purest objective unity, namely that of the a priori concepts, space and time, is only possible through relation of the intuitions to such unity of consciousness. The numerical unity of this apperception is thus the a priori ground of all concepts, just as the manifoldness of space and time is the a priori ground of the intuitions of sensibility. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, page 136. This power Kant is referring to has the function of combining the manifold of representations into one unity. Intuition for Kant is that which brings us into immediate and direct contact with appearances, which are not things in themselves, but signs of this transcendental object Kant designates with an X. In the stream of thought, it is the categories of our understanding/judgment that provide the universal and necessary unity of representations in the case of knowledge. These fundamental concepts are intimately connected with the transcendental ego and apperception, which is manifested in our self-consciousness. One such fundamental concept is that of causation, that necessarily connects the representation of a cause with the representation of the effect, which is illustrated in our perception of the change in the position of a ship steaming down a river. William James' mechanism of association would not be able to produce the knowledge of why the ship is moving downstream, if its respective positions were merely associated without necessity. These respective representations of the ship's position in space at different times are, therefore, represented on Kant's account as necessarily connected in the consciousness I have of myself. James, of course, denies both this unity and the necessity of the categories. The knowledge of why the ship is changing its position as it does is, therefore, according to Kant, due to the fundamental concepts of space, time, and causation. For James, his analysis of judgment is tied up with the power of thought to think something about something, and it begins with a something that is given to us in feeling, which enables acquaintance with the thing to begin. When we begin to operate upon that feeling by thinking or analyzing it, we then begin a cognitive relation to what we are acquainted with. For James, feelings can be both sensations and emotions, whilst thoughts are conceptions and judgments. Volume 1, page 22. In his account of the stream of conscious thought, James includes all forms of consciousness, but he does not believe sensations as such are important in this account, since he claims they are not what we experience. Rather, the idea of sensation is a result of an act of discrimination, which identifies this basic idea as an element of consciousness. Every stream of thought, however, is owned by a personal consciousness that is continually changing, and related to objects that appear independent of this personal consciousness. Attention is focused on some aspects of these objects which we choose because of our interests, that in the case of the ship could range from an interest in taking a trip downriver to the design of the ship, or even an interest in the power of the river, etc. For Kant, the ship steaming downstream can be a pure matter of intuitions which are organized by the imagination initially. Whilst this is occurring, we are probably dealing more with a stream of a simpler form of consciousness, rather than with an articulated stream of thought that would result in a cognitive judgment about the event, whether that be in terms of the idea of a ship's essence as being capable of navigating the river in the way that it does, or alternatively in terms of the river's power to take waters to the sea. If this experience gives rise to a judgment such as the ship is steaming downriver, then we are dealing with a relation of concept to object that is true, which is a fact, i.e. we form an epistemic judgment in which we know that it is true that the ship is steaming downstream. Had T.S. Eliot been witnessing this event, he may have seen an unusual aspect of the river's power which he expresses thus: "I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce, then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in the cities, ever, however, implacable, keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder, or what man chooses to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated, by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank ailanthus of the April dooryard, in the smell of grapes on the autumn table, and the evening circle in the winter gaslight. The river is within us, the sea is all about us. This poem is an articulated poetic experience which may have been provoked by the sight of the ship steaming downstream. The experience is symbolic, and the poem is a linguistic articulation of the latent content of the experience, which has what Paul Ricoeur terms a double meaning, resting in the feeling of the sacredness of the river, and the harmony of the faculties of the imagination, the understanding and reason. There is clearly also an ethical import expressed in the above poem, an import perhaps also expressing the sacred view of humanity we find in the Greek oracle's proclamation that everything created by man is destined for ruin and destruction. We ought to know our own natures, but without the poetic courage of the poets we would choose to forget the oracular proclamations and look upon rivers in purely instrumental terms.